Okay, folks, here we are in lesson 6 for quarter 3 of U.S. history. It's great to have you back, and we're going to spend a little time talking today about something called the Great Depression, and also the response to the Great Depression by the government called the New Deal. You can see the time frame here. We're talking right at the end of the Roaring '20s, where we had this upturn, excitement, lots of money flowing through the system after World War I. And this really goes up to about 1932 or the mid-1930s. And the interesting thing about this particular period of history is that it is very similar to what we are facing right now with our economy. So the thing that, the Great Recession, which is what they're calling it right now, that we've been dealing with for the last couple of years with high unemployment, loss of value of homes, people moving, economic difficulties, is very similar to what happened back in the late 1920s for some similar reasons. So it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. We talk about history occasionally repeats itself, and here's an example of kind of how it has. And you can get an idea of what it looked like for people and whether or not it's similar to what the people of America are dealing with today. So let's talk a little bit about the Great Depression and really what led to it. And what led to the Great Depression was the fact that the stock market was incredibly optimistic after the 1920s. The election of President Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican and kind of a hands-off kind of guy in terms of the economy, big business supporter, and there was a lot of thought in the stock market in New York City that this would be a time of real optimism. So there was an over-speculation in stocks. Lots of money was put into the stock market, into companies that really probably shouldn't have had that kind of money in. And something happened called the margin call, where people called for their money. People demanded the money, corporations demanded the money, and it wasn't there. And so that led to a collapse of banks, where the banks did not have the money to give back to people when they wanted it. And that bank collapse happened on something called Black Thursday, which was October 24th of 1929. And that's really the day when the banking system fell apart and the stock market crashed at the same time. And so people's money that was all tied up in these stocks and in these banks all of a sudden wasn't there. So if you had invested $100,000 into a bank, feeling like it was safe, it was just not there. And there was no such thing as insurance at that point for money in banks, and so you just lost everything, and a lot of people did. But let's go back a little further. That's exactly what led to it, but why did that occur? Well, it led to this Great Depression for a lot of the same reasons, as I said, that we're dealing with today. There was an overproduction. Think about Las Vegas with the housing market, an overproduction of homes, and low demand. So when people lost all their money, we had all this material, there was a low demand for it, and that led to layoffs. So that sounds very familiar to us, especially in Las Vegas. Low wages, okay, with people either unemployed or underemployed, led to consumer buying power being reduced. So if you went from a fairly good job to a job that paid a little bit less, you're buying less stuff, and all of a sudden now there's no demand for anything. Another problem was overseas we couldn't sell stuff because foreign tariffs were very, very high on American goods. So it was hard for American companies to sell things to Europe, to sell things to Asia, so we didn't have that demand particularly. We also then saw more unemployment, reducing that buying power because they didn't have anybody to sell things to, so there was no reason to make stuff, and so people were laid off. And that just led to what's called a negative feedback loop, the fact that it continually got worse. And as there was less demand for goods, more people were laid off, they had less money, so that led to less demand. You could see the cycle kind of spiraling downward, and that's really what the Great Depression looked like. So what was life like for the average American during the Great Depression? Well, as I said, really what the first thing was is that any kind of savings that anybody had, especially if they put the savings into a bank or into the stock market, was essentially wiped out. It was gone. There was no recouping it. It just was there one day and gone the next. And of course we also saw a loss of employment. So people that had jobs that felt very comfortable about their jobs, those were gone. We had approximately a quarter of the U.S. was unemployed at that time. And just to give you a reference point, right now our unemployment is about 10% in the U.S., which is very, very high. But here we're talking about a quarter or 25% unemployment during the Great Depression. people had to rely on handouts essentially to live a lot of times, and so soup kitchens or kind of places that would feed citizens for nothing sprung up in lots of cities. So we saw lots of people standing in line waiting to get the handouts that they could from local cities and organizations. We had things called Hoovervilles, which really were tent cities that were set up as people lost their homes and they had nowhere to go. They would set up tents in parks and things like that, and as kind of a negative to the president, they were called Hoovervilles. At the same time, in the Plain States, in Oklahoma and Kansas and North Texas, we had an economic or an environmental disaster called the Dust Bowl that also occurred, which led to this becoming even worse. And farmland that had been farmed and raising good crops all of a sudden was destroyed in what's called the Dust Bowl. You'll read more about that. And we had a demographic shift. We had people leaving their homes that they had lived for a long time and moving to other areas of the country where they felt there was a better opportunity for them, specifically California and the Southwest. So, obviously we have it a little better off. Most of us, a lot of people are suffering, there's no question about it. But, things like the demographic shift, we see that. Certainly a lot of people are leaving Las Vegas to go back to places that they have better root systems to assist them through these tough times. So what did the president do? President Hoover, as I said, was really kind of a big business guy. He wasn't a big government guy, but he really recognized that something had to be done. People were questioning the role of government. What's the point of the government if they can't protect the citizens in these horrible, horrible economic times? So he started some projects, some public work projects, to try to push some money into the economic system. He started building roads, big roads, highways, and then also dams, and really started the construction of the Hoover Dam, which of course is, we know quite well, over there on the Colorado at Lake Mead. He was the first president that really started that process moving. He also started something called deficit spending, and the U.S. government is excellent at that now. That's what leads to these huge high deficits that we owe. But this is where the government was spending more money than they were bringing in taxes. And the point of this was to try to spur and jumpstart the economy as well, get some money out there. And certainly we see that, have seen that over the last year or two with President Obama, and before that President Bush's deficit spending to try to jumpstart the economy. The government also lent to banks to try to shore up the banking system, once again very similar to something we've been doing recently, and then was providing welfare to citizens, so giving money to help those that were unemployed or underemployed make it through the difficult times. So what did the people do? The people are hurting, and people, the citizens of the U.S. are very good at trying to rally around themselves, rally around their country during short periods of difficulty. We certainly do that very well. But as it drug out, as this depression drug on, people got very frustrated, and we had marches in the streets of cities called hunger marches, where people were protesting the fact that they were hurting so much economically. We had farmer revolts. Farmers couldn't sell their crops or were having trouble selling their crops, and so they were revolting against the government. And we had what's called the bonus marchers. The bonus marchers were Army veterans, folks that had served in World War I, who had been promised extra pay at the end of their service, and the government had never fulfilled that particular promise to the veterans. So they marched on Washington, D.C. to demand their bonus. They wanted their money. They needed it. And Herbert Hoover actually called in the U.S. Army to clear the bonus marchers out of the Capitol. So, you can think that's a pretty amazing headline, to have folks that have served their country in World War I having to be cleared out from protesting by the current army. It's kind of not what you want if you're a president. Not a good front page picture, that's for sure. Well, in 1932, it was pretty much no question that Herbert Hoover was not going to be reelected. He had not responded enough. It may not have been his fault. There were a lot of factors that were outside of his purview, but ultimately what happened is he was replaced by a new president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's one of our most famous presidents at this point, partially because he served the longest. He served actually, or at least was elected to 4 terms as U.S. president, which is 2 times more than any other president has ever done in our history, and was the president during not only the Great Depression, but also during World War II. So we'll talk a lot about President Roosevelt over the course of the next couple units. But let's take a look at his background real quick. He was from a wealthy New York family. This was a man of privilege, certainly not a man of the people, but he understood the people fairly well. He was a distant relative of Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt from the early 1900s. He had been New York senator in the Congress and also the New York governor prior to becoming president, and he was nominated by the Democratic Party in 1932. And he really was a breath of fresh air. And again, to kind of look at analogies and look at connections between history, he was followed very much like President Obama was during Obama's campaign, whereas this, we've had 8 years of one president. A lot of people were looking for change. He was a beautiful public speaker, much like our current president, and so people started to get very excited, started to get kind of their hope back that we could actually get through this.